a humanitarian crisis in the Americas. Shortages of food and medicine, fear of police and the government send millions of Venezuelans to seek refuge in nearby countries. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet just last month had to devalue its currency, dropping 5 zeros from the bolivar to try to slow runaway inflation and fleeing citizens. The United States is calling Venezuela a kleptocracy. That's a government with corrupt leaders using their power to exploit the people. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley said Venezuela's widespread corruption has unleashed instability, violence, and human misery. Venezuela and the United States, they've been at odds since the turn of the century. New reports that U.S. officials met with coup plotters within Venezuela's military will do little to heal a fractured relationship. VOA's Steve Reddish brings us up to date.
Ha llegado la hora de la recuperación económica y necesitamos.
August's apparent assassination attempt against President Nicolas Maduro punctuated a downward spiral of Venezuela's economy and society. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Maduro inherited a crumbling socialist economy that tipped further when oil prices crashed a year later. The government cut public spending, established price controls, and printed more money that became worth less and less by the day. Shortages of food and basic goods created a black market, often run by militias loyal to Maduro. Millions of Venezuelans fled out of hunger, fear, or both. Human Rights Watch estimates that 2.3 million Venezuelan refugees are scattered through the Americas. 1 million of them are in Colombia. 250,000 are in Ecuador, while Peru hosts nearly 400,000. Maduro consolidated power in 2017 with a violent crackdown on opponents, prompting a threat from the President of the United States.
We have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option.
Maduro won another term as president in 2018. It was a widely discredited election that was boycotted by the opposition parties. The United States imposed new economic sanctions in response. Steve Reddish, VOA News.
Of the 2.3 million Venezuelans who have left the country since 2014, half have left in just the last 18 months. Most of the refugees are in 3 nearby countries, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. VOA Spanish service correspondent Celia Mendoza has been to see the refugees, and she's here with me to tell us their stories. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Greta.
What have you seen?
Well, it's a very, very difficult situation for Venezuelans. We have seen people that have walked and crossed Colombia from Cucuta all the way to Ecuador to be able to go to Peru to try to find medicines, food, and a future for their families. But also we have seen a lot of children, pregnant women that have gone through this journey, and that is evidence that things are not going well in Venezuela. We also have seen the help given by the international community, by the receptor countries. We have Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, even countries like Chile have offered help to all these people. And this is something very particular for the region. We haven't seen this movement of people ever in the region, and that is something the United Nations has compared with the crisis in 2015 in the Mediterranean, and that is something that definitely has not been forecast in terms of preparation by each of the countries in the Americas.
Is there 2 things? One is that do you get a sense of horrible desperation on the part of the people who are living in Venezuela? That's the first question. And then these host countries who are receiving them, whether it's Colombia, Brazil, Peru, or Ecuador, are they feeling a real pinch in terms of having these refugees, and are their citizens getting upset because I'm sure that jobs, resources are in play?
Definitely. The people that we have seen in the borders are desperate. Many of them don't care if they have shoes on. They walk for days, and that is an evident picture of what is happening inside the country. But as you mentioned, it's definitely a sense of pressure by all the Ecuadorians, Peruvians, Colombians. We have seen march, and we have seen people that have reacted against Venezuelans. In Brazil, we have seen mobs of people going after Venezuelans. Just recently, we had a case where a Venezuelan was murdered by the people of Brazil after a crime was committed. And this shows the tension that has been building up, especially right now that we have a larger amount of Venezuelans moving out of the country. And that, as we have asked some some of them is result of the economic changes that the president has implemented in Venezuela.
Are they breaking up families, leaving some of their families behind so that, it's some leave in desperation, some are left behind for this hyperinflation, terrible situation in Venezuela?
Yes, we have seen men crying on the border. We spoke to a father who said, this t-shirt I have on me, and it had the picture of his wife and 3 children, is the only thing that I have from my family. I left because I need to feed them, I need to bring money to them, but it's definitely a separation of families that is becoming a rule in the Venezuelan families right now.
What a crisis. Anyway, Celia, thank you very much. Venezuela's Supreme Court in exile asked Venezuela's military and Interpol to arrest President Maduro to face trial on corruption and other charges. The Supreme Court is in exile because in 2017, Maduro threatened long jail sentences to any of the 33 justices appointed to the bench by the legislature. I spoke to Miguel Angel Martin, who is the exiled court's Chief Justice. When you left Venezuela, how did you get out of there?
I had to leave in a small motor launch from the Venezuelan coast. I rode the launch for 7 hours to a Caribbean island. Later on, I came to the United States.
Did your family go with you?
No, they left later on. Today, my wife and my children are free, thank God. However, my parents and my brothers remain in Venezuela.
What if you hadn't left Venezuela? What do you think would have happened?
I'd be in jail. One of my colleagues was detained for several months in a bathroom in a cell in a dungeon in Venezuela. It would have meant not only more suffering for my family, but it would have also precluded me from fighting for the return of freedom to my country.
Of the 33 justices, you said 3 are still in Venezuela. How are they being treated?
Out of the 3, we only have information about one, who lives under restrictions. He was locked up in a dungeon, and I understand that now lives at home with restrictions. As for the other 2 justices, we have no knowledge of their status or their situation.
As I understand it, the Attorney General brought the case saying there was corruption on the part of Maduro in millions of dollars having to do with a construction company. Is that the case that you have sentenced him to prison for?
First, this was a public trial. It took place in the headquarters of the Colombian Congress, which lent its space to the Venezuelan judicial system. Through more than 5,000 pieces of evidence, it was demonstrated that Maduro received bribes from Odebrecht ombudsman. He also caused harm to the nation. As a result, we sentenced him to 18 years and 3 months in prison.
When was he sentenced to 18 years in prison? Just recently?
Yes.
And the prosecutor is the Attorney General who's in exile? She brought the case?
Yes. According to the Constitution of Venezuela, charges against those who serve as presidents of the Republic must be brought up by the Attorney General. In the case of Venezuela, she is in exile. These charges and these trials must be authorized by the Venezuelan Congress, which is in Venezuela. Following every step established by the law, we, in a public trial, not only declare that Maduro was guilty and that he must go to jail, but we also sentenced him to pay fines in the amount of $25 million for bribery. He must also reimburse Venezuela $35 billion. As a result of this trial, he is to be removed from office, which will result in a power vacuum. What I mean is, Nicolás Maduro is not the legitimate president of Venezuela, and as a result, he does not represent Venezuela. His signature has no value. He cannot sign any accords that may commit the Republic of Venezuela.
Who's behind the assassination attempt on Maduro? Do you know?
No, I don't know who is behind it or whether it's true or not. What has been proven, however, and I, as Chief Justice of Venezuela, have evidence of the fact that Maduro and his regime are part of a transnational criminal organization which implicates several countries and represents a growing threat to the region. His regime not only endorses drug trafficking finances terrorism in Venezuela. Dangerous groups such as FARC, ELN, the Syrian Republican Guard, and ISIS reside in Venezuela. Venezuela is part of their territory. What I mean is, these groups are not going to let power go, because behind Maduro, there is a band of criminals that threaten the region.
Well, you can't have the transition until Maduro's out. What's the plan to get Maduro out if you have one?
As President of the Supreme Court, my goal is to strip down the regime to reveal that it is an outlaw state, that Maduro, besides being corrupt, is not the legal president of Venezuela. As a result, I ask other countries not to have relations with Nicolás Maduro's regime. Instead, they should help crack down on his regime so that the rule of law and democracy return to Venezuela. All reconstruction plans will be implemented as soon as us, Venezuelans, return to our country.
Have you spoken to people in the Trump administration, and if you have, what help are you asking the Trump administration for?
Throughout his journey, what we've tried to do is create an awareness among the international community about what the ultimate goal of the Maduro regime is. Venezuela is both a bank and a mine. What they are seeking is to control political power in the region. We have given testimony of what is happening in Venezuela to the United States, as well as other governments that cherish and love peace. We have requested that we build alliances so that we can free Venezuela of the evil that engulfs it. It will be very difficult for Venezuela alone to overcome this great problem, because this isn't a problem of a dictatorship in one country. This goes far beyond. This is organized crime, where several countries take part, where drug traffickers are using terrorism to negatively impact the country. What we've asked the United States for, in the forums where we have been present, is help in freeing our country.
The New York Times recently reported that there were contacts between U.S. officials and coup plotters within Venezuela's military. According to that New York Times report, a disaffected Venezuelan general reached out to the Trump administration after hearing President Trump in 2017 threaten military action against Venezuela. In the end, the U.S. decided not to help those trying to overthrow Maduro, who has called the U.S. imperialist bent on getting rid of him. For a deeper perspective on the U.S. relationship with Venezuela, I am joined by Patrick Duddy, former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela from 2007 to 2010. He was then expelled from Venezuela in September 2008, but then President Hugo Chavez, who claimed the U.S. was plotting his overthrow. Duddy returned to Venezuela in 2009 to finish out his assignment. He is now the Director of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Duke University. Patrick Duddy joins us via Skype from Atlanta. Nice to see you, sir.
It's very good to be with you.
Sir, you have met President Maduro. What are your impressions of him?
Well, in the first instance, he's not nearly as charismatic as his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And I believe that particularly since 2013, he has become, first, increasingly desperate to hold on to power, and second, increasingly authoritarian.
Well, there was recently an attempt on his life, an assassination attempt. Any thoughts on that? Is that show a level of the dissension from within, or do you think that's outside influence?
The incident to which you refer, in which there was apparently a drone attack in the general vicinity of President Maduro, is still very unclear. And even the legitimacy of its being characterized as an attack is not entirely established. But there is lots of evidence that there is massive disaffection in Venezuela. As your earlier guests outlined, millions now of Venezuelans have left, and recent polling would suggest that given the means to do so, many millions more would leave, absent a change at the top and a change in policy in Caracas.
Is there a way to describe the Trump administration policy towards Venezuela, and does it differ in any profound way from President Obama's administration or even President George W. Bush administration before that?
Well, the Trump administration has made very clear that its preference is for a peaceful solution, and they are relying primarily on diplomatic means to try and encourage an end to the crisis. They are, of course, meeting with a wide range of disaffected Venezuelans, but in doing so, they continue to emphasize their preference for a diplomatic solution, for the restoration of democracy, respect for human rights, and the opening of a channel for humanitarian assistance. That said, the government has taken more steps, including imposing some financial sanctions on the government of Nicolas Maduro, and in doing so, they have moved somewhat more aggressively than the earlier administrations.
Where do you, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but where do you think this is all heading?
Well, there's an ongoing debate among those of us who follow developments in Venezuela closely. And it seems to me there are sort of two visions. One is that, like, for instance, Zimbabwe of a decade or so ago, the country continues to spiral down, but doesn't necessarily explode. It simply, to use a kind of homely metaphor, it simply circles the drain perpetually, and the people live in increasing misery. The other is that there is some sort of social explosion, a la, for instance, 1989, and what is now known as the Caracazo, when there was major rioting all over the country in response to sort of an extreme economic crisis. I'm not sure which of the two is more likely, but the current circumstances appear to be unsustainable.
Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Not all Venezuelans are against President Maduro. Jesus Silva is among those who believe Maduro is honest and trying to end corruption. He is a doctor of constitutional law and hosts a show on Venezuelan state-owned TV. Jesus Silva joins us on Skype from Caracas. Nice to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Sir, what do you believe is the problem that is brewing in Venezuela? Who would you point your finger at?
I think that my country is fighting against international conspiracy. For instance, there is a man who says he is the Supreme Court Justice of Venezuela, but he is not. It's a fake justice. This individual actually is a fugitive of Venezuelan justice who was appointed in illegal procedure. So in this context, I must say that there is only one Supreme Court, which is based in Caracas, and it has 32 justices, members of the Supreme Court. So the allegations by this individual are completely unfounded. I must tell you that there are economic difficulties in my country, and the government is taking measures to solve such difficulties. For example, the new currency that is somehow mitigating the devaluation process that we have been suffering. But I must also remark that economic U.S. sanctions have been affecting our economy. It is not permitted for the Venezuelans to have access to U.S. currency for international transactions.
All right. Let me ask you a quick question. You caught my attention off the top. International conspiracy. Why would countries have an international conspiracy, any country, against Venezuela? What would be the motive?
The motive is that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. So this is very attractive for many foreign governments and also foreign companies. So there is a clear attempt to overthrow our regime, our democratic regime, to overthrow our president in order to have rapid access to those oil reserves. In my view, it is completely unfair to demote the electoral processes in Venezuela if there is no evidence of fraud. Just a few months ago, President Nicolás Maduro was reelected with 7 million votes, around 7.
Is it fair to say? Is it fair to say there was some question about the election? You know, that the opposition thought that the fix was in for Maduro, so that they didn't vote. That they thought that the election was. You're talking about the May election. That the May election was an unfair one.
That's the point. The allegations against the electoral process that resulted in the re-election of Maduro are completely unfounded, because there were many opposition candidates running in this contest. They were defeated. They were defeated by Maduro, who got the majority. So there is no evidence of any fraud at all. According to international standards, the election was clean. The election was fair. There were witnesses of the election who came from other countries, and they watched the complete procedure that resulted to be the re-election of President Nicolás Maduro.
If your form of government works, if President Maduro is doing a good job, why does it seem that the country keeps deteriorating further and further and further, and any efforts that he's done to sort of turn it around, I guess in your view, have failed?
Because foreign sanctions against our economy are producing a negative result. Venezuelans have no possibility of international transactions with U.S. currency. And for good or for bad, the main currency in the Americas is the U.S. dollar currency. So in this context, it's very difficult for us to have access to buy medical products, to buy sound fluid. So we are under a terrible amount of political pressure and diplomatic pressure against us.
Sir, and with that, I've got to go, but I do appreciate joining us. I hope you come back, because I assume we're going to be talking a lot about this story.
Thank you.
Joining us, Gonzalo Concay, Chief of Staff to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. In May, the OAS found that it is reasonable to believe crimes against humanity have been committed in Venezuela. Nice to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the issue about crimes against humanity, our last guest, who supports President Maduro, says it's an international conspiracy and that a lot of the economic problems are the result of the sanctions against Venezuela. You respond how?
Venezuela is a dictatorship. Venezuela is the worst kind of dictatorship. It's a dictatorship that kills, that tortures, that starves its people, that have created the worst migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere recent history. And we can go on and on and on with the catalog of horrible things that have been caused by this regime directed by Maduro and his gang there. So no, it is not foreign conspiracy. It is a dictatorship that is doing the worst things that we have seen done in this hemisphere.
In terms of what? I mean, what are they doing to their people? I mean, obviously we see the long lines, we see people leaving, so that's obviously a sign that, you know, things are, but specifically?
First, it is a dictatorship because people cannot vote. As you mentioned recently, elections in Venezuela are not fair, are not transparent.
They claim it was fair. They claim, you know, Maduro says the election was fair, and you say no, and I guess then the international community says it was not fair.
The international community says it is not fair. Opposition leaders couldn't participate. You did not have international observation by electoral observation missions, by the OAS, the European Union, the bodies that usually observe elections. There is no separation of powers. The National Assembly cannot do its work. They have created Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, totally illegal, totally taking the functions and the powers of the National Assembly. I mean, it is a dictatorship because of that. It is a dictatorship because they have political prisoners. They have almost 300 political prisoners right now just because they think differently. They have political leaders in jail. You cannot say what you think in Venezuela if you're a political leader because you risk jail.
And what do you think? We had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in exile was just on our show, and they have sentenced President Maduro to 18 years of prison. What do you think Maduro's reaction when he hears that?
His reaction is not the central thing here, because the central thing here is in Venezuela you only have 3 democratic institutions that still remain. One, the National Assembly, voted by the people in 2015, December 2015. Second, the Tribunal Supremo de Justicia in the exile, which is the true and real Supreme Court of Justice, because it was elected by this National Assembly that was voted by the people. And 3, the General Prosecutor. Those are the only 3 institutions that remain democratic in the country. But we can go on and on with the catalog of things that this regime has committed against these people. We can go and explain about these crimes against humanity for which Maduro and the people that are part of his government should one day go to The Hague and be tried by the ICC.
What's the reaction from the neighboring community? You've got Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil. They're all getting refugees flowing into the country, and there were some that are coming into the United States and other nations. What is the impact on the neighboring countries?
It is a very, very, very concerning impact and devastating in some places. We have more than 2 million Venezuelans all around the region. We have a severe impact in Colombia, in Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and we can go on and on to at the same time. You mentioned the US. The regional community, the inter-American system is reacting. Countries have been very generous towards Venezuelans that are fleeing this regime. But at the same time, of course, no country alone can face this kind of situation, which is unprecedented. So we need regional coordination. We need coordination at the Organization of American States level in order for the countries to be able to receive these Venezuelan migrants that need support, that need help, that need to be integrated to the host country.
What started this? You've got Chavez came to power about 1998, but what started this recent sort of crisis that led to U.S. sanctions and all the problems that we see in Venezuela? Is it the ideology? Is it socialism? Is it dictatorship? What is it?
Like Secretary General Almagro said, the thing is, when you don't respect human rights, when you don't have democracy, when rule of law is not what prevails in the country, when arbitrary detentions and political prisoners are evidently there in the country, when you have the evidence on a reasonable basis that you have crimes against humanity, there you have a desperate people that cannot exert their rights, its rights. So they are starving. The economy is not working. Their political rights cannot be exerted. If the government wants, they send them to prison. If the government wants, once they are in prison, they torture them. If the government wants, they kill them. We have had extrajudicial killings in Venezuela. So it is a desperate people that needs to flee the regime. And it is caused by the lack of democracy, by corruption, by a government which is involved in drug trafficking and which is involved in criminal activities. When you have that, you have a disaster. When you have a disaster, you need solutions. What are the solutions? Yeah. Democracy, justice, rule of law, respect, and promotion of human rights. That's why Secretary General Almagro created this panel that produced a report, a 400-page report, where there is evidence about crimes against humanity committed by the regime in Venezuela. And it has been submitted to the International Criminal Court. I can leave you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Before we go, a reminder of the danger facing journalists in Venezuela. Jesus Medina was helping colleagues with the reporting project at a Caracas hospital. Medina was arrested on August 29th by agents of Venezuela's intelligence service. He has been charged with money laundering, which has been used previously by the Venezuelan government against journalists. And he's also been accused of violating a 2017 law against inciting hate in the media. Medina was previously detained in October 2017 while reporting at a prison. He said his kidnappers tortured him and threatened him with death. The Committee to Protect Journalists is calling for Medina's immediate release. That's all the time we have for today. You can now podcast this show and previous episodes of Plugged In on voanews.com. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.